Chapter 1. The Vaccine Story. Quote, "The past is your lesson, the present is your gift, the future is your motivation." Unquote. Anonymous. Let's go back to March 23rd, 2021, the day that launched the idea for this book. I'm sitting on an uncomfortable plastic chair in a Walmart superstore in Henderson, Nevada, waiting the obligatory 15 minutes after my first COVID-19 vaccine shot. I've been staring intently at the small square of paper in my hand, my vaccine record card. I keep reading it over and over, fixated on the sparse bits of information on the page. There's my name, date of birth, the date, store number, and the Moderna batch number. While I didn't experience any side effects from the vaccine during the waiting period, I did have an existential crisis about the future. My short and long-term health outlook depended on this small piece of paper, which I would need to hold on to for the next 4 weeks until I could get my second dose. Where do I store the paper so it's safe and I can also find it? I'm good at hiding important documents to keep them secure. Unfortunately, I'm not as good at retrieving said documents. The locations are so secure that I often forget where I hid them. Now, I have to hold on to this paper indefinitely until I get the information to my primary healthcare provider, insurance provider, employer, and potentially other various government entities. My fixation on this small slip of paper led to questions about the provenance of the vaccine now coursing through my veins. I started to wonder, where did Moderna batch number 002B21A come from? Was it stored at the proper temperature throughout the chain of custody? Was it handled properly once received? What ingredients went into it? And where did they originate from? I started wondering how many various entities touched this vaccine dose from the time it came off the production line until the time it was injected into my arm. None of these questions I could answer. What ingredients went into it? And where did they originate from? I started wondering how many various entities touched this vaccine dose from the time it came off the production line until the time it was injected into my arm. None of these questions I could answer. That's the moment I had two diametrically opposed thoughts. First, I panicked as I realized the American healthcare infrastructure is an absolute disaster. I can have my contact information, all my transportation tickets, and my banking in a digital wallet on my phone. Yet, for my health and livelihood, I must carry proof of vaccination on a piece of physical paper. I know electronic health records, EHRs, have been around for quite a while, yet the two aren't even remotely connected. And supply chain traceability has been around for an equally significant amount of time. Am I supposed to accept that this is how we manage supply chain information? This led to my second realization. At that moment, I realized that the problems plaguing the healthcare system weren't unique to healthcare. I came to appreciate that we need to collectively reimagine how we design, build, and operate supply chains. This book sets out to determine why we're operating in a disconnected and archaic fashion that makes our supply chains decidedly insecure, and most importantly, how do we change? When I started writing this book in the summer of 2021, we just had 2 ships beached in the Suez Canal, ongoing labor shortages, the threat of dock worker strikes, the semiconductor shortage, ships stuck off the coast of LA, and the start of the Great Resignation. Each month brought another disruption of some sort. By the summer of 2022, supply chains were backlogged due to China's zero-COVID policy, a potential American West Coast dock worker strike, inflation, a somewhat debatable recession, continued labor shortages, and logistics capacity constraints. This on top of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which, though not a supply chain disruption, see Chapter 7 sidebar on page 65, Why Wars Are Not Supply Chain Disruptions, has put additional pressure on global markets. And this does not account for the global climate crisis. By the time this book has gone to print, there will undoubtedly be more disruptions to add to the list. In fact, I argue we'll go bouncing along from disruption to disruption for the next 10 years. Today's supply chain problems were created by decisions made in the late 90s through the 2010s. During this time, the world was a fairly stable place, at least for conducting trade in a globalized market. As a result, many of the preferred strategies enacted squeezed cost and maximized profit by extending global supply chains. Naturally, this created brittle and fault-intolerant supply chains that are primed for security breaches. The goal of this book is not to critique whether these were good or bad decisions. Historians and future scholars can tackle those questions. The issue now is how we fix the problem systematically and for the long term. How do we take the steps today to build a safer, more sustainable 21st century supply chain? What are we doing? At the end of 2019, I was approached by a client who wanted to engage Kearney to help them negotiate with their systems integrator, SI, for their future supply chain. They wanted to consolidate their 10 ERP systems down to a single big ERP system because they are, quote, a big ERP shop, unquote. They had selected Big SI as their systems integration partner because they viewed Big SI as their, quote-unquote, corporate SI. Unfortunately, the project was already 4 months behind schedule and $96 million over budget. And the worst part? The implementation hadn't even started. While I'm not a negotiation expert, I do know that if you're unwilling to switch technologies or SIs, you won't be able to negotiate $96 million off your price. Of course, once the implementation started, the project was further delayed and the budget overages piled up. This company has approximately $5 billion in annual revenue and a market cap of $8.5 billion. So not exactly a financial juggernaut. If this is the best that the collective we can do to create a digital supply chain, we should just stop what we're doing and walk away. But I don't believe it's the best we can do. I'm pretty certain that there's another, better way to hack our supply chain, escape the oppression of old technology and subpar implementations, and move towards a system that's more secure and better equipped for the future. Why this book? Why now? I was motivated to write this book for 3 reasons. First, I wanted to continue the story from my first book, Trade Wars, Pandemics, and Chaos: How Digital Procurement Enables Business Success in a Disordered World. Second, I made an error I wanted to correct from that book. Third, while supply chains have become common topics in public discourse, I continually ask myself, what is a supply chain? Reason number 1, my moment of clarity. Some readers may be familiar with my previous book. As I was writing the last few pages, I had an epiphany. It occurred to me that supply chains have become increasingly externalized. If you look at the end-to-end supply chain, it is predominantly a series of third-party entities, from contract manufacturers, co-packers, and third-party logistics providers, to the myriad of direct and indirect suppliers who provide the necessary materials and services. Once we look at supply chains as a conglomeration of third-party entities, we can start to see what we didn't before. For fans of the Matrix movie, this is the moment where Neo recognizes the Matrix as a simulated reality that he can manipulate. If supply chains are simply an amalgamation of third-party entities, then they are at significant risk. The number of third parties touching the packages, pallets of packages, and containers of pallets is staggering. Each third party in the corresponding handoff introduces risk. Even non-product supply chains such as banking or software, while not tracking physical goods from here to there, still have many third parties they're engaging with. More succinctly, the greatest risk to the supply chain comes through the third parties. The more third parties, the more difficulty managing them and subsequently greater risk. Conversely, the greatest ESG and innovation opportunities come through third parties. At the heart of these third-party risks and opportunities is the need for sophisticated data exchange and digital competency. This represents a fundamental recalibration of the supply chain management profession. To run a modern supply chain, we need to embody a digital-first culture. A digital-first approach will require us to embrace new technological systems, data management, and sophisticated analytics. It also requires our teams to have vastly different skills and capabilities, and gives us the opportunity to reimagine and simplify our processes. Please note that these will not be shock changes. They will occur over time. The key is that we start setting North Stars now. Reason number 2, my moment of atonement. In Trade Wars, Pandemics, and Chaos, I made one grievous error. I fell into consultant groupthink. It's an easy mistake to make. In consulting, once an idea or topic emerges, it becomes a race of one-upsmanship as everyone scrambles to establish their view on the topic du jour. Artificial intelligence, blockchain, ChatGPT, cryptocurrency, COVID-19, monkeypox, supply chain disruptions, inflation, the Russia-Ukraine war, and Industry 4.0 are just some of the thousands of topics that have emerged in the consulting profession. The problem is that consultants, analysts, and pundits treat the topics superficially and lack sufficient depth to be useful to practitioners. In the process, a collective groupthink takes hold in which nobody says anything that's too different from the others. See Chapter 7, Hacking Resilience, How Quickly Can Your Supply Chain Recover, for a clear example of this. This is the mistake in trade wars, pandemics, and chaos. While completing the manuscript, I panicked and lobbed in some risk-related content that was neither useful nor differentiated. It wasn't wrong, just not helpful. Here's the excerpt in question. Quote, as part of our new risk management approach, we need our category and commodity managers to be enabled to model different strategies in response to various risk situations. Part of their job description should include doing forward-looking what-if analyses to test and create alternative outcomes in case of disruption. Then, as risks unfold, the proper strategy can quickly be deployed based on changing dynamics. The strategy should then be matched with clear roles and responsibilities in the response and finding the right balance between cost and risk mitigation/resilience. It is important to include accountability measures that continually track and evaluate the efficacy of strategy and actioning. Companies need to continually test the efficacy to ensure the proper allocation of resources in response to crises. Finally, automation should do the heavy lifting on low-risk events and should augment human intelligence augmentation on higher-risk events. Automation can also help run simulations and do the forward-looking scenario planning. This automation should take the form of anticipatory solutions that prompt users to think about what threats could happen and how to respond, and predictive solutions that predict threats that will likely happen. Unquote. Rereading this makes me cringe because it does not get to a level of detail to be useful. I apologize to everyone who read that section. I have written an updated risk chapter that I hope is practical and applicable to atone for that mistake. Reason number 3, my moment of philosophical musing. What is a supply chain? This question often keeps me up on sleepless nights. This seems like a simple question with a simple answer. And yet, ask 10 supply chain practitioners that question and you are likely to get 10 different answers. I talk to people from around the globe at companies from a few people to the largest enterprises. I'm always surprised at how many ways people describe supply chains. Add in the explosion of news stories, pundits, technological innovation, and we have a profession that is working without a clearly articulated definition. A supply chain is one of those terms we seem to understand implicitly without a formal definition. The traditional description is, quote, transforming raw materials into a product and getting it to customers, unquote. Ames, UK Logistics, defines a supply chain as, quote, the art and science of obtaining, producing, and distributing material and product in proper place and in proper quantities, unquote. Those definitions have formalized into the plan, source, make, deliver paradigm. Many curricula, training, and organizational structures are built around these towers. In recent years, quality and reverse logistics have become added. The problem with this lack of clarity is that it increases the likelihood of mistakes. When one hand doesn't know what the other is doing, say planning and procurement or manufacturing and deliver, then critical information is likely to get dropped or misinterpreted. This is how we have ended up in a situation where most of today's supply chains run on Excel and email. Naturally, this creates a gigantic security risk and constrains our ability to meet customer and/or corporate objectives. I hope in some way this book can facilitate a discussion that helps us to create a more precise answer. If for no other reason, it will help me sleep at night. How to read this book. The topic of supply chains is vast and seemingly overwhelming. Throughout the writing and editing of this book, I have often wrestled with the unwieldy scope of this task. With that in mind, I decided to use this book to address as many of the relevant topics as possible. As a result, I have structured this book like a graduate course, whereby we'll dive deep into multiple subjects under a loose organizational umbrella. This allows for going both broad and deep into the material. Then we'll come together at the end to connect the dots. Feel free to read this book straight through or jump to the chapters that are most relevant and/or interesting. Please note, I have changed the names of individuals and companies to protect privacy and confidentiality, unless I have express permission or the information is in the public sphere. My argument. Today's supply chains are woefully insecure and lack sufficient resilience. Most supply chains were designed in a previous decade, if not century, at a time when enterprises controlled and ran most of their operations in-house. Yet today, a predominant number of supply chains have anywhere between 10,000 and 50,000 third-party entities that they interact with directly and tens of thousands further down the line, for example, a supplier's supplier. With this much reliance on third parties and associated complexity, we can no longer operate our supply chains in the business-as-usual manner. We must do something dramatically different. We must instead rebuild our supply chains from the ground up. To do that, we must hack our supply chains to make them more secure and resilient and ready for the 21st century. For the purposes of this book, security is the act of protecting, and resilience is the ability to bounce back from disruption. We need to embrace a culture of digital, increase our algorithmic and data literacy, and adopt a hacking mindset. In this context, hacking is looking critically at our systems, technical and processes, tearing them down to their core component pieces and reassembling them to meet the ever-evolving risk environment. According to security expert Bruce Schneier, quote, hacking is a useful tool to understand a broad array of systems, how they fail, and how to make them more resilient, unquote. He goes on to note, quote, hacking targets a system and turns it against itself without breaking it. It subverts the intent of the system by subverting its rules and norms, unquote. Ultimately, this book is focused on how we get vastly better at managing third-party relationships to improve security, decrease risk, and ultimately create more resilience. All three will bring about value for any enterprise. A global cyber war is underway right now, but most of us aren't aware of it. Enterprise supply chains are the most vulnerable to attack. If we can't even get toilet paper and cleaning supplies during a pandemic, what happens when our collective manufacturing systems are breached? Look no further than Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where both sides are deploying the most sophisticated cyber weapons against each other's infrastructure and suppliers. At the beginning of the war, one of Russia's weapons manufacturers was hacked, and schematics for Russian weapons were posted online. Hackers had exploited a vulnerability in the manufacturer's email server, which Microsoft had patched a year earlier. The supplier had neglected to apply the patch. The cyber fighting is not limited to the two countries either, but many other entities have become involved, including organized crime, Anonymous, the Hacktivist Collective, and pretty much any hacker with an interest. The problem is that the battlefield is not limited by physical boundaries in a digital world. The even bigger problem is that the sophisticated cyber weapons being deployed against nation-states have been and will continue to be used against nearly every enterprise business. Compared to nation-states, enterprise businesses are very soft targets. And if enterprises are soft, their suppliers and third parties are more vulnerable. This is just the beginning. We still have many physical security vulnerabilities in our supply chain. Typically, these occur in the space where the physical and digital world intersect. Most concerningly, people pose the greatest risk to our objective of secure and resilient supply chains. We must take a series of important steps to protect against these threats. First is to make our entire teams, and especially leaders, highly proficient with digital capabilities. To be clear, one does not become digital by taking classes. Being digital is not a trainable skill. Digital is a culture, a way of being. To truly become digital means having the right level of motivation and social incentive such that one decides to remove all obstacles to achieve their learning objective. We also need a flexible and extensible set of digital technologies at our fingertips that is built around secure data exchange with the proper third parties. This means moving away from legacy technical debt toward a more sophisticated, bespoke set of individual capabilities that are seamlessly integrated with one another. Armed with a new culture and digital capability, we can begin to address building tomorrow's supply chains today. By making our supply chains more secure from the ground up, we will increase their resilience, efficiency, and social consciousness. There are many ways to look at the end-to-end supply chain. This is simply one. I'm not going to talk about Lean Six Sigma process improvement, optimizing the network of distribution/fulfillment centers, or lights out planning, which are all very valid topics, along with many more, and worthy of nonfiction books unto themselves, or perhaps fantasy books in terms of lights out planning. This book instead is about how a new approach to digital can reduce third-party supply chain risk and help organizations build the next generation supply chains. As a futurist, I am very skeptical of overhyped technology. Those familiar with my work know that I hate buzzwords, jargon, and erstwhile technological hype. I try to avoid the use of the terms AI, machine learning, blockchain, RPA, and the like. However, I will use them as a point of departure to explain and/or explore the underlying concepts. For example, I will talk about supply chain provenance in this book, and naturally, the question comes up, quote, what about blockchain, unquote. I will answer this by explaining how we achieve provenance in a digital world, what can go wrong, and how blockchain or any other technology might be a good fit. And yes, blockchain is overhyped and has underdelivered. Too often, technology hype outpaces both the business need and the ability of people to understand it. In that chasm between capability, need, and understanding, people start to imagine that the technology represents a quick fix to an otherwise intractable problem. But the secret is that there are no quick fixes and no magic button. My previous book was about identifying the villains and holding them accountable. Fun though that was, that's not the goal here, though some folks may feel unduly poked at. I am working to move us all to a new place. Of course, in the process, old ways of working will fall by the wayside, and we will see pretty quickly that old technologies aren't sufficient. I'm looking at you, big ERP. This doesn't mean we have to throw out the old, but we need to acknowledge that buying a new ERP system or consolidating 50 ERPs down to one is solving yesterday's complexity problem. To build the next generation supply chains, we will have to get vastly more skilled at how we employ digital capabilities, correspondingly change our processes, and improve our capabilities. The third-party landscape. Traditional business logic has stated that the customer is always right. Implicitly, this makes the customer the most important person in a business environment. I challenge this view by arguing that the third party is equally as important because if you can't get raw material for manufacture or deliver the product, you have nothing to sell the customer. Some of my colleagues contend that the employee is the most important entity in business because if you can't staff your enterprise, you can't sell anything to the fictional customer, much less produce and deliver it. Obviously, all three of these entities are important. Tomorrow's enterprise success will be based on getting the balance right between customer, employee, and third party so that everyone wins. Historically, this equation has been out of balance to the detriment of the third party and arguably the employee. For the purposes of this book, third parties are any entity that interacts with an enterprise that is not a formal employee or the customer. This includes suppliers, partners, for example, healthcare providers, dealers, authorized representatives, government organizations, global, national, state, local, non-governmental organizations, for example, the Red Cross, Amnesty International, transnational organizations, such as terrorist organizations, organized crime, loosely organized collectives of like-minded people working together, for example, the Hacking Collective Anonymous, and individuals such as evil billionaire villains. To build the next generation supply chain, we need systems that properly exchange data and defend against all of these entities. This is about putting these third parties front and center in the operations and in defense of our enterprises. One of the least appreciated changes in our supply chains is exactly how much they rely on third parties. For example, consider the number of third parties required to produce, distribute, and deliver the COVID vaccine to my arm. At a minimum, there were the suppliers who provided the source materials that went into the vaccine, the logistics companies that transported the source materials, the manufacturer, Moderna, that produced the vaccine, the companies that shipped it to the Walmart distribution centers, the logistics companies that sent the vaccine from the DCs to the Walmart store. And in this simple example, that assumes that Moderna did their own production. Industries like consumer packaged goods make extensive use of contract manufacturing and packaging suppliers to produce their goods before sending them on to third-party logistics companies for warehousing and distribution. Not only is it complicated to visualize, but there are also some additional crucial problems. First is tracking data on all these systems. There is no universal data format, exchange mechanism, or even incentive to share data across all of these third parties. Second, supply chain organizations are typically not built to handle end-to-end operations. Third, as should be obvious to even the most casual observer, there's tremendous opportunity for risk and disruption. Any nefarious character can break in any supply chain. It doesn't matter what the industry is, and it's not that hard. You simply need to vector through the third parties. Finally, the technology underpinning today's supply chains was designed and developed in the 1980s and 1990s and hasn't really evolved to confront the third-party way of operating, hence creating the data visibility and exchange problem. Think about some of the recent high-profile data breaches, such as Best Buy. The third party that provides chat services for the chain was breached and the customer payment information was stolen in 2018. Home Depot, hacked by using a supplier's name and password to infiltrate and steal 50 million customers' payment information, resulting in a $17.5 million settlement. And Target, where hackers stole a third party's credentials to access internal systems and steal 41 million customer payment records. T-Mobile has been breached 9 times since 2018. These are all strikingly familiar in scope and impact. Bad actors attack the third party to gain credentials and to use the credentials to access the target network, install malware, steal payment information, and get rich. Then there was the SolarWinds attack, which exploited a weak third party in the software supply chain and embedded malware that was surreptitiously distributed further up the chain to the real targets, businesses and governments. These are all quote-unquote supply chain attacks, in that they go for the weakest part of the supply chain, the third parties, and then they use that to exploit further upstream. A supply chain attack is both pernicious and successful because the entire chain is built upon trust. All an attacker needs to do is find the weakest part, exploit it, and use the implied trust to work their way up the chain. So our jobs as supply chain managers, designers, and architects is to question the implied level of trust of third parties. This extends to third parties we don't even control, such as non-governmental organizations, certain political entities, or organized crime. We are at a once-in-a-generation moment as supply chain professionals. There is little doubt that governments will increasingly regulate supply chains, if not designate them as national security interests, or perhaps even nationalize them. So this is our opportunity to define and build our future before it is done to us. A new approach to supply chain design. I am arguing that we need to refine our understanding of how to do supply chain management data exchange to mitigate risk and increase efficiency. That means we need to establish intelligence across the entire supply chain and be nimble enough to pass that off to any and every third party that needs it. For example, consumer products will increasingly need to have provenance associated with them, which requires capturing every step of the source material, manufacturing, and distribution tied to every product. We also need a new generation of fit-for-purpose digital tooling and architecture. We must disavow ourselves of the notion that the ERP will lead us into the future, much less be relevant. And we need to increase the capability of everyone who does supply chain management. In Trade Wars, Pandemic, and Chaos, I argued for the following skills. 1. Business athlete, understanding the entirety of the business across multiple functions, not just the supply chain. 2. Motivation, finding the right levers to motivate employees to engage in learning. 3. Digital, wanting to embrace and exploring technology. 4. Analytically minded and data-driven, applying data to solve business problems. 5. Emotional intelligence, reading and reacting appropriately to other people's emotions. 6. Creativity, imagining and communicating beyond simple frameworks or playbooks. 7. Problem lifecycle management, taking ownership of a problem from detection to resolution. 8. Advanced communication, communicating in multiple formats, written, visual, and so on. 9. Superb presentation skills, telling a good story that is anchored in deep expertise. 10. Executive presence, learning to confidently interact with all manner of executives. 11. Building respect/reputation, strategically building and curating a personal brand. 12. Synthesize for a multiplicity of audiences, learning to present confidently to various audiences from the boardroom to the warehouse floor. For this book, I wanted to double down on these skills and discuss how we build them, and to add a bit of urgency to this, since AI, namely generative AI, has entered the zeitgeist. Quote, it's not the AI that will take your job, it's the person using AI that will take your job, unquote. More broadly, we need to flex our digital skills and competencies. That means taking ownership and architecting systems that interoperate versus the traditional monolithic system. The transformation true-up. The key to securing our supply chains and ultimately making them more resilient is to make the most of the vast amount of sophisticated digital technology available to us. Whether it is AI, cloud infrastructure, robotics, sensors, you name it, successfully employing these innovations will make supply chains and enterprises more efficient, effective, and perform better. Traditional logic has suggested that enterprises need to undergo massive digital transformations to embrace digital. Collectively, enterprises have spent billions upon billions of dollars on digital transformations. In the process, they've paid consulting companies, tech providers, and systems integrators to make them quote-unquote digital. Recent studies have pegged the transformation success at less than 50%. I am very happy that everyone is attempting to digitally transform. But it is galling that so much money is spent for such little impact. When I talk to people running supply chains, analysts to executives, they operate in a digital 1.0 realm. Digital 1.0 uses email, spreadsheets, shared drives, PDF files, presentations, and offline notes. If one is going to digitally transform, we should stop relying on those old methods. The adoption of all these tools dates back to the failures of ERP systems to transact in a flexible and extensible manner. But even beyond these tools, most employees I encounter don't possess adequate digital skills, such as algorithmic fluency, which is understanding what different algorithms do, data conceptualization, which is visualizing the data needed against the data possessed, and tool competency, which is determining the best tool for the problem at hand. So we need to ask some questions to do our true-up. A true-up is an accounting term that means reconciling an estimated budget effort with the actual expenditure. We can use the same concept to assess the efficacy of digital transformations. If we spent 10, 25, 50 million on a digital transformation, was there a corresponding change in the level of digital ways of working and competencies? Did leaders redesign and even eliminate archaic processes? Are employees making use of all the powerful cloud technologies? Did the organization become data-driven and create breakthrough intelligence insights? Sadly, the answer is almost always no. In their current form, transformations are a shield for perpetuating the status quo. They create a redoubt of inaction and excuses. If we do an accounting of what changed during a transformation, the answer is rarely anything significant. Sure, an organization may have changed a few ERP systems, added some new planning software and transactional systems, and provided some training. The goal is often standardization, which simplifies IT but ultimately isn't that useful. Digital is messy. The messiness yields the nimbleness. We see this in startups. Everything is a fire drill, a burning platform that drives excellence, learning through failure, and ultimately success. Traditional enterprises need to stop looking longingly at digitally native companies like Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. Digital transformations are sold as if they will take a 100-year-old company and make them, quote-unquote, a data company and, quote-unquote, digitally native, whereby everything is one click and you have access to perfect data and insights. Throw in some buzzwords and you have promises of grandeur, which have no prayer of being achieved. I have yet to see any traditional enterprise closely approximating Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. Perhaps we should stop deluding ourselves and set different goals for what it means to digitally transform. If we're going to undertake a digital transformation, let's start by evaluating the applicability of digital to the operation of our specific business and use that as the starting point.